Susan Rowland, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for asking me, Brian.
Well, yeah, thanks for taking me up on the offer. We're here to, I mean, you've written many books,
Mhm.
and I think today it'd be good to focus in on the book on Jungian Arts Based Research. You sent me the introduction to it, and I was actually quite excited by it and quite inspired.
Mhm.
And so I'm excited to talk with you about this today because it's an area of Jungian study that I don't think I've really encountered before.
Mm.
Before we get to that,
There's
yeah,
not a lot of it about, yes.
what what's that?
There's not a lot explicitly written about this area from a overtly Jungian point of view.
Hmm.
Um, Sean McNiff was the pioneer here, but he didn't really go into the way in which Jung was part of this enterprise.
Okay. Before we dive into that, I wonder if we could just hear a little bit about your background.
Mm.
Particularly, I'm interested in when you got interested in psychology.
Well, I got interested in Jung. I didn't get interested in psychology, and I'm not trained in psychology. I was doing an English literature degree in Oxford, in the UK in the early 1980s, and I was um, having some religious issues, having come from a parent, my mother, who was very fundamentalist in her Christianity, and a friend gave me his copy of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I read it. It seemed to make a lot of sense, and it seemed to offer an approach to the psyche and to religion that I could be comfortable with. So I retained my interest in Jung while going through um, degrees in literature and realized that there wasn't really very much literary theory that included Jung. There had been some Jungian literary criticism. This seemed to have been marginalized and was no longer practiced. So when I came to do my PhD in literature, I wanted to go back and look into Jung and see how far a Jungian approach to the psyche could contribute to a psychological literary theory.
Hmm. Was there a particular author that you looked at through the Jungian lens for the PhD?
Um, What I realized was that in the 1980s in the UK, a number of novelists had written quite well-known novels, in some cases winning awards, where there had been an explicit use of Jung, that these novelists knew about Jung and included a Jungian dimension into their work. So I decided to look at two female and two male authors. The female authors were Doris Lessing and Michelle Roberts, and the male authors were Nicholas Mosley and Lindsay Clark. And that became my doctoral thesis, which was eventually published as my first book, C.G. Jung and Literary Theory. And I got interested in sort of how gender could be a tension in these novels, a tension that was also to be found in Jung's work. And that led on to writing about Jung and the feminine. And of my Jungian books, the most famous one, I suppose, is Jung, a Feminist Revision. And that continues to be of interest to people, even though it came out over 20 years ago. Towards towards the end of my work on Jung and cultural theory, I discovered arts-based research and realized that it really wanted to have Jung in it. But a lot of the literature, academic work on arts-based research didn't have Jung in it. And so I wanted to write a book with Joel Weishaus on Jungian arts-based research because he'd been producing Jungian arts-based research for decades without having that theoretical framework around it. And one of his most powerful works is The Nuclear Enchantment of New Mexico. And it seemed that there would be an opportunity to write a book for people who were interested in arts-based research and people who were interested in Jung, and to include in the book a very powerful example of what could be done with Jungian arts-based research. Because the whole idea, I think it's an idea whose time has come, because it draws on very deep currents that are both historically powerful but have been radically marginalized in Western modernity.
Hmm. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about arts-based research, because it was a new framework for me, and I'm sure some of the listeners, it'll be new to them too.
Yeah. Well, this is something that has been developed in universities since the 1990s, and principally in the social sciences. And research has a lot of different connotations in our culture, but it's culturally been dominated by the idea of science and the scientific method, whereby new knowledge is made by experiments that are repeatable. So somebody can do a experiment in Vancouver, it can be replicated in Sydney, Australia, and will have the same results. And that is then taken to be proof that something has been discovered, that some new knowledge has been made. And that's fine and has produced a lot of very powerful discoveries that have influenced and shaped the world we know today. If you kind of look closely at what's going on there, you can see that this research is dependent on what's known as the subject-object split, that the researcher has to be totally separate from the matter being researched. And this is said to guarantee objectivity, and that this is a very good thing. Unfortunately, there is a kind of worldview there that is no longer taken for granted, because if you're going to rely on the subject-object split, if you're going to rely on that kind of scientific research, you are presupposing that the world, reality, consists of stable objects that you can just find out about by going through this process. Now, that is really not actually how the world is currently seen. Also, it doesn't work for some kinds of research. In particular, it doesn't work for research on people, particularly groups of people. So researchers who were involved with, say, researching into education, researching how, groups of people work in society, they realized a long time ago that they needed different form of research, and they developed this research called qualitative, which means that the researcher is involved, is allowed to be involved in the research, is allowed to be talking to people, is allowed to take their own feelings and thoughts into account. So that was happening, and that's been going for quite some time. It's been useful. However, there's still something not being included in the way the researcher is allowed to be part of the research, and that could be called the imagination. And it's not a radically new thing to suggest that artists doing any kind of art, from painting to photography to poetry writing to filmmaking, that when you do art, you discover things, that things come up or things are put in such a way that something new comes out of it. If you go back far enough in Western modernity, you find poetry, for example, being used as a way of understanding the world, as being used as research. If you go into other cultures, you find things like the arts, storytelling, for example, being used as medicine, or being part of religious practice. So the idea that the imagination isn't important, isn't capable of discovering anything new, that art isn't research, this comes to be seen as the product of a particular history in modernity, and not as a kind of self-explanatory situation. So in the social sciences, they're developed this thing called arts-based research, and it means that art is not the result of research, but that doing art can be a research process. And one of the things that was recognized fairly early on was that when we're talking about art as a research process, we're talking about the psyche producing images that are then materialized in the art form. And these images can end up in music, they can end up, visually, they can end up verbally, but they are a materialization of something in the psyche. And about that time in the 1990s, Sean McNiff began to write about arts-based research for trainees of psychotherapy. And he used a Jungian framework of the psyche, but he wasn't very explicit about it. 20 years later or so, Jung's Red Book was published in 2010, and it's attracted a lot of attention and a lot of critical writing. And it's been recognized as a pioneering form of arts-based research. There's an irony to this because, it is very artistic. It has experimental paintings, it has experimental writing. Jung made it in the 1920s in the form of a medieval manuscript. So he was clearly using artistic ideas and processes to try to get somewhere with his own psyche. And in the end, he seems to have rejected the Red Book because it was too artistic and not scientific. And he was in a world that demanded that he become scientific in some way, or justify his work as science. So now in the 21st century, he's recognized as a pioneer of arts-based research, and that is becoming recognized as real research. So I saw this, and I saw that many of my students are very creative, very artistic, and that if it would be possible to examine what a Jungian perspective could bring to arts-based research and make that explicit, that this might be useful for people who care about Jungian psychology, to want to investigate the psyche in a creative way. And it might be useful for people who want to do arts-based research to have a greater understanding of Jungian psychology and how it could help. For example, Jung devised what he saw as a therapeutic practice that he called active imagination, which is working with a psychic image and allowing it to develop its own autonomy and being. It's long been recognized that this is something that artists do all the time. And now it can be recognized as a form of research, whether that research, whatever kind of artistic form that working with images eventually takes.
Mhm.
Mm.
And would it always be research into the nature of one's own psyche or the psyche in general, or could you apply that to any area of research?
I think you can apply it to most areas of research. This is, that's a great question, because this is something that's very exciting. Yes, Jungian arts-based research can be applied to the psyche. It can be applied to one's own psyche. It can be applied to, say, the psyche of a group or even the psyche of a culture. But it can also be applied to something very different. I don't want to say that anything could be researched in this way, but one of the reasons we decided to put the nuclear enchantment of New Mexico in this book is that that particular epic poem is an examination of how and why and what are the implications of producing weapons of mass destruction. That poem examines what these weapons of mass destruction are, the multiple histories that it comes from, the horrible effects of using these weapons, and what it means psychically, both to individuals and the culture that continues to develop these weapons. No one would immediately suggest that Jungian arts-based research can research nuclear weapons, but it has done so in a very successful way. So you could use Jungian arts-based research to very kind of big external topics, what are the responses to or the way in which we might be imaging the climate emergency, for example. Or you might want to use Jungian arts-based research to look at a particular place, a relationship to a particular place, or a particular city, or a particular group. For example, people have worked with migrants, people have worked with underprivileged populations by, for example, making a play with them. You can do it collaboratively. You can do it individually, but you can also do it collaboratively. And that can then lead to new knowledge that you would not have got any other way. My own practice of Jungian arts-based research is writing mystery novels, and I'm trying to write about the modern world and experiencing the modern world through the lens of a detective story. And pretty well every novel I've produced, and I'm working on my fourth, the third one is about to be published, there has been material come up in the process of writing that is unexpected and revealing. So, for example, in the first published novel, The Sacred Well Murders, I wanted to investigate the way in which the Western, the way in which we all come from an Indigenous society. Even in my case, the Indigenous society is long in the past. So someone who's come from the UK, back when my people were Celts. We don't know much about the Celts. We know a few things. So I investigated that by having 21st century people feel called to become Celts, and that this created problems. So we have this. So this story kind of eventually was assembled, and I did quite a lot of research into the Celts to include this in the story. But a couple of things happened during the writing that were very much from my unconscious and not from my conscious mind. And in particular, one character wakes up after being in a coma, and she's lost her identity, and she comes out with, "I am the wife of Leah and I have no name." Now, that her coming out with that was her and not me. You know, the image spoke to me, as it does in these Jungian oriented practices. So, okay, I went with that and I let her be the wife of Leah for a good part of the story. It wasn't until the very end of writing that story, several months later, that I realized what that could have been about, which is that this Leah character, who is a real character from Celtic research, that this Lear is also the prototype of King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear. And one of the interesting things about that play is that King Lear's wife, the mother of the daughters, is never named. She's clearly dead. She's not named. There is no reference to her. She is a big hole in the play. And yet, as the queen, and as the mother of the family, she is the only person who could have stopped the catastrophe. So she stands for the powerful mother archetype, if you like. And so very deep down, as I was doing this writing, this idea of the divine mother, if you like, had come through the processes. So I have, over the last few years, been working with students doing Jungian Arts Based Research projects, very variable projects. There is a student of mine who's finishing a PhD, and her art practice is weaving. There's been filmmaking, and there's been photography, and there's been painting. And during the process of doing the art, stuff comes up that wouldn't otherwise be manifested. And having this thing called Jungian Arts-Based Research is a way of understanding it as research. And on the one hand, this is very new, because universities, the academy, has not recognized art as research for forever. And on the other hand, it's not that new, because in many ways it it goes back to a different worldview, the worldview of alchemy, in which alchemists were, we think of them as proto-scientists, but in many ways they were artists as well. And they wrote about the art of alchemy that was also the science of alchemy. So in a big way, this is about healing splits in knowledge, splits that have dominated modernity and contribute to the way in which our culture is itself split and causes psychic splits in people.
Hmm.
Mm.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say maybe not just alchemy either, but these other ways of knowing through intuition and imagination. Like I think about the yogis and their maps of the
Exactly.
chakras and
Yeah.
energy lines, the meridians in Chinese medicine, these kind of
Mm.
shamanic indigenous
Mm.
practices that formed a kind of worldview
Mm.
for those people, and
Yeah.
that was the way you got to know things is
Mhm.
through, visionary states and dreams,
Mm.
observing nature,
Mhm.
letting the imagination speak through nature. Yeah, so it does feel like a kind of reclamation of an earlier
Mm.
way of knowing that has been denigrated since the Enlightenment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And I mean, this Jungian arts-based research is can be quite big and can cover a lot of areas. There is another framework which covers what you've just said and what I've been talking about, and that's um, transdisciplinarity
Mhm.
um, as expressed, as argued by Basarab Nicolescu, who has a book From Modernity to Cosmodernity. And he explicitly, he, the crucial thing about his vision of knowledge is to get rid of the hierarchy, to get rid of this idea that Western produced knowledge, and in particular physics, is somehow the top thing and everything else is subordinate in some ways or even completely mistaken. He says that we need to be thinking of knowledge as a network, and that the knowledges of Indigenous people, the knowledges through the body, he doesn't actually say this, but implicitly the knowledges of the arts, that these knowledges are as valuable as any other knowledge, and that we need to get to a state of transdisciplinarity where we're no longer doing colonialism through knowledge, that rather we can decolonize the world of knowledge by having this transdisciplinary sense whereby what he calls tradition, the traditional shamanic knowledges, are regarded as equally knowledgeable, equally powerful and effective. And of course, in today's world, with so many crises, and in particular crises of mental illness, it may be that the shamanic, creative, intuitive knowledges should be considered more important because we are suffering from their neglect and repression and denial.
Hmm.
Mm.
And how? Yeah,
Mm.
I'm glad you brought up decolonization. It was what
Mm.
was coming to my mind as well. And I spoke with Dylan Hoffman, who's one of your
Mm.
colleagues at Pacifica, and
Yeah.
that was a subject matter that we spoke
Mm.
about at length. And it's kind of a central project for me these days.
Mm.
Um, I think even these intuitive, imaginative ways of knowing are perhaps not just equal in value to so-called empirical science, but perhaps even primary
Mm.
too. Um, And I think about those examples of scientists who come from a dream or some kind of psychedelic experience
Mhm.
with a vision of the DNA helix or
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and then through their scientific method, prove that theory to be
Mm,
as true as I guess a theory can ever be, but it's kind of validated through the
mm,
scientific methodology. Um, those just seem like, they're treated as kind of anomalies,
mm,
kind of strange, maybe
mm,
coincidences or something. But I think it speaks to something deeper that Jungian arts-based research is trying to get at.
mm. Yeah, I mean, this arts-based research, and particularly in its Jungian form, is really a new paradigm. But it's also not a new paradigm because in so many ways it is a rediscovery of knowledges that Indigenous cultures hold. And so it is very important to see it as potentially really important as a decolonizing move, because decolonizing is something we all want to do, but it is actually quite difficult. And to feel that even out of this culture that we're born into, that splits our psyche, that it's possible to kind of find these elements of ways of being that at least get close to the ways of what's been lost.
Mhm.
I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think one of the main difficulties that I can see is that we're, we're formed by the colonial
Mm,
worldview.
mhm,
And so the practice, well, decolonization, I think has to come out of an experience, a kind of breakthrough of
mm,
the irrational or the synchronistic
mm,
that kind of shocks your system
mm,
to open up to other possibilities.
mm,
I don't know if it's something that can kind of be grasped cognitively and just
mm,
and worked at. I always feel like there has to be that kind of numinous breakthrough
mm,
that challenges the egoic structure and causes a kind of breakdown. So
mm.
for me, I'm trying to always promote practices that can induce that kind of breakthrough because I see
Yeah.
that as the kind of the seed of the revolution.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we can't stop being the product of our culture, upbringing, and in particular our education. Um, but and also, although we could perhaps apprentice ourselves to shamans, I'm not sure that somebody like me, for example, could ever truly become part of an Indigenous culture, because and there is the danger of appropriation,
Mhm.
and the fact that we have to take seriously the extent to which we've been indoctrinated into the colonized paradigm. But we can deconstruct the the kind of psyche that we are continually encouraged to have. And I think Jung did that in his understanding of the necessity of building a relationship with the irrational that would ultimately decenter the ego. Um, that he still remains in many ways a product of a kind of white Eurocentric colonial culture. But I think he instinctively realized that what we'd lost, and what we done to others and done to ourselves through colonialism was ultimately going to destroy us. So he kind of did a lot of the digging away of the hype of rationality. And when we get to the way in which ensouled, you might say, or individuating arts practice can encourage that encounter with the numinous that can be done through other ways, but it can encourage that encounter with the numinous that is visible. I mean, one of the things that I like about Jungian Arts Based Research is it's also about communication. It's about changing the world. And as I like to say to Jungian clinicians, it's doing therapy with the world.
Mm-hmm.
What you end up with is a work of art that materializes the idea of the psyche as having independent energies and the images being independent of the ego. So that work of art can go into the world, it can go to other cultures, it can last for 1,000 years, and the artist doesn't own the result. The artist is deeply involved with making the art, but the artist doesn't own the meaning. The meaning is something that is renegotiated by every viewer or consumer or witness of the art. And that means that it's decolonizing in that way too, because there is no kind of great artist on the sort of romantic model of the artist, where the artist was like God, was the ultimate creator, and this idea that the person doing the art or writing the book owns the meaning of the words. Well, no. The art is a kind of permanent treatment, goes into the world and changes the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like that shift that happened somewhere along the way, maybe in the Romantic period, where the artist became a genius
Mm-hmm.
rather than the genius being a kind of tutelary or guiding spirit that
Yeah,
accompanied everyone.
yeah, exactly.
Everyone had an accompanying genius,
Yeah.
and you could either be in touch with it or not, I
Mm.
guess. Yeah, but that kind of claiming the kind of dissolving of the genius into the individual and the kind of
Mm.
heroic ego that gets
Yes.
put forward. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's often overlooked that individuation begins with the death of the hero. This is not about the heroic ego or the heroic artist as somehow conqueror, but rather the death of that kind of colonial dominance.
Hmm. And we could maybe transpose that the death of the hero as to, well, the heroic attitude of the kind of Western empiricist,
Mm.
that if I can measure it, I kind of own it, I can
Yes,
dominate it. That
exactly.
Christian ideal that's
Yeah,
woven into it, dominion over the world.
yeah. No, that's exactly the case.
So
That
it's very subversive, right?
Yeah, it
Hmm.
is absolutely entirely subversive. Um, and this whole business of heroism is, I think, very culturally contested at the moment. Um,
To say
and
the least, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we can get into toxic masculinity, for example, at that point. Although Jung does talk about the hero once or twice, he assimilates the hero in one of his essays, I think it's the Trickster essay, where the hero becomes Christ. And of course, the thing about Christ as a hero is he ends up on a cross. He does not end up as the ruler of his land. And Jung's explicitly against that kind of ego dominance form of heroism, despite his own problems with the feminine.
Yeah. I'm interested to read your book, The Feminist Revision
Mhm.
book on Jung. Yeah. Because that has always been a problem for me with Jung is the anima split, the contrasexual
Mhm.
idea. I mean, the first time I encountered that, it didn't
Mhm.
it didn't feel right to me. It didn't seem true to my experience, and I was just like, why is this idea still kicking around?
Mm.
And then I found Hillman, of course, who
Yes.
questioned all of that stuff, you know, Jung's idea of the self, the kind of heroic
Yeah.
or the godlike self, let's say, the heroic quest um,
Mhm.
to unify with the self. Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wi- I'm assuming that because you teach at Pacifica that you have a kind of affinity for James Hillman.
Yes. I like Hillman's work a lot. And I think his polytheistic psychology um deals with a lot of the problems in Jung. Uh Jung kind of is very hung up with Christianity. And that I think that's one of the reasons that he's so hung up with opposites. I mean, it's there in his philosophy background, but the whole business of God and Satan and all the rest of it. And that's partly why you get the anima animus, this desire to have somehow see masculine and feminine as opposites, which, you know, doesn't work at all. Um, what I like about Jung is, historically speaking, he gets, and this is the feminist summary here, that Jung gets that modernity is sick because it has repressed or rejected so much that has been designated as feminine. And in that sense, he's a boon for feminism. However, Jung's Jung wants to rescue modernity for men. So the feminine becomes the anima, and the anima is a way of saving men from this lack of the feminine in modernity. You know,
Mhm.
socially, Jung was not at all interested in men and women having any equality. He wanted to save men. And
Right, the anima was like a redemptive figure for the
yeah,
middle-aged man.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And James Hillman does a wonderful kind of undoing of that through his polytheistic psychology. I guess from a female point of view and also from a 21st century point of view, I think we need to kind of go beyond Hillman's affection for the Greco-Roman gods.
Yes, please.
Um, yeah,
I've
I
been
mean,
calling for that too.
yeah,
My joke is that like he said we have to go south, and he meant like the south to the Mediterranean. And I
yeah.
said, like I joked with Dylan Hoffman, I said, no, there's a lot more you could go further south, James.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I mean, I think what's clear from studying Jung and Hillman and all the others who've written about this with some authority is that myth is psychic shaping, and it's not any particular myth. I mean, Hillman felt that he was talking to the Western world, and the Western world had been built on Greco-Roman myths, and that's an argument. But we're not in that world anymore.
Mhm.
We are in a world where we need to kind of recognize that we need to decolonize, and we need to see other cultures through their myths, and how that reveals the psyche in other cultures. And you know, many students at Pacifica are looking at that. And that's partly why I wanted to go back to the Celts as opposed to you know, the Romans and the Greeks that came, were kind of either melded with or the Celts were seen through them.
Mhm.
And you know, it's a very interesting foundation to have for the mystery novels. The
Mhm.
other thing that has come recently through Hillman is, and he's not explicit about that, but I think he could have been, and that is sexuality. That really Freud and Jung felt that human sexuality was developmental, and it really isn't, it's archetypal. And so I say in Jung, a Feminist Revision, I argue from the fluidity of Jung's psyche that there's no reason why you know, women should not have an anima and men an animus, that same-sex love is not, you know, something that needs to be seen as outside depth psychology. But kind of thinking recently, it is indeed archetypal in the sense that people who feel non-binary, that trans or same-sex love, these ways of being are equally can equally be considered within depth psychology.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, hmm, yeah, there's a lot of places we could go from there. I wonder if we could circle back around to arts-based research.
Of course.
I guess one question I still have about it is what distinguishes a Jungian arts-based research from other arts-based researches?
Mm.
Is it the incorporation of something like an active imagination or like the preliminary to the art making, the active imagination or a dream,
Mhm.
for instance, or is it the kind of Jungian framework of archetypes, ego
Mm.
unconscious, all of that that we use to read the artwork once it's been made. You
Mm.
can see I'm like pointing at like maybe like three steps of the art making process, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, basically either and both. Um, I mean, I don't think Jungian arts-based research is necessarily going to look very different from arts-based research, because it seems to me that arts-based research does things that could be called Jungian if they were recognized as Jungian. Um, what I've come to, a way I've come to present Jungian arts-based research is in stages, which I've called the 4 Ps. And the stages are paradigm, project, paradigm, preparation, process, and projectio. So paradigm is the arts-based research. It is the Jungian arts-based research paradigm, which I think is stronger and more metaphysical than the arts-based research paradigm, because the Jungian arts-based research paradigm recognizes synchronicity, and emphasizes the independence of the artwork, because the artwork is modeled on the Jungian idea of the image as being independent of the ego. And so the artwork in the Jungian arts-based research paradigm is independent of the consciousness or the dominance of the artist. And it is potentially connected to things in the world that are knowable, like genre, but also it may be connected to things in the world that are unknown through synchronicities that have happened, but also synchronicities that are yet to have happened. So, if I might be reading a poem that was written 1,000 years ago, and there is a synchronous event happening because that poem is speaking to something that to my dream last night. So there is that particular paradigm, and I think understanding that paradigm is a good place to start. The next
Can
step,
I just pause there for a second? I can see that kind of functionally working to even more so help loosening the claim of the artist on the work as the
yeah,
maker of the work, but rather maybe more as a an interpreter or manifester of the psychic image that has its own autonomy in life and reveals itself to the observer who can then make art.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Okay.
think that's a terrific way of putting it. I mean, I don't have a problem with the word maker, but uh, maker in the sense that you're collaborating with something. You're
Mhm.
collaborating with the unknown psyche, but at a certain level, you're collaborating, which includes collective things. At a certain level, you're collaborating with reality, the world, whatever, seen as inspirited.
Right.
Um,
Like you're participating in creation.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And we see that in Jung's writing on synchronicity. So there's that, and then preparation, I think, includes, especially if you are doing a formal research project that you want to present as research, preparation includes the regular kind of academic research that you might do. So I read books about ancient Celts, for example, but it's not limited to that, because if you want the whole psyche, then you've got to prepare the whole person. So you might start paying attention to dreams and doing active imagination. Um, the 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 more ways you can involve your body in the preparation is, that's very important. So in I live in America, but I visit the UK. I made a point of going to places and Celtic sites, and being immersed in what was left
Mhm.
of that world. So that
Right. So it could be a number of things, like even like pilgrimage, like you said,
mm,
uh, uh, encountering geography, but maybe even ritual.
yep,
So bringing in like smells and
yeah,
other ritual components. I can imagine like maybe finding Celtic songs and
yeah,
singing them. And yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could put it in terms of the kinds of preparation a shaman might do. Um, so preparation, and then there is process, and process is paying attention to the psyche as you are engaged in the art making. And that might include doing active imagination or amplification with things that come up during the process of making the work. Um, Talking to people about different art forms, even the things that we think of as very rational, like using a camera to make a film. Actually, some of the best film directors do kind of acknowledge the way in which their psyche influences what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that the sense that there are images coming up for them as well as coming to them through the camera.
Yeah, well, a great example is David Lynch, who
Yeah.
really lets his kind of dream process
Mm.
inform his filmmaking process, and talks about actually kind of being surprised at what emerges through this
Yeah.
collaboration with the depths, let's
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then projectio, which is just a term taken from alchemy, putting the work out there, that can be quite complex. I mean, I use that really to mean two things. One is different ways we might encourage the work to generate meaning, but also putting it out there and enabling it to have a relationship with the world, however that happens. So kind of to demonstrate how meaning can be made, in the book I use an idea from one of the social science theorists of arts-based research. There's a book called The Arts-Based Research Primer, which I think is really useful. And in it, James Rowland Jr. Categorizes, he suggests 4 types of arts-based research. And his 4 categories can actually be very helpfully used as 4 ways of making meaning. So his first category, he calls it analytic, which is actually a rather unhelpful term because it doesn't mean analyzing. It means to what extent the art is saying something new or different about its materials. So a painting will sometimes say something about paint or paintings, or a poem will be saying something about the nature of poetry or the nature of language. And if you apply that to a work which might be your own and you haven't thought about that, new stuff kind of comes out up. For me, it's with, what are my mystery novels saying about mystery novels? And that's actually quite interesting to see what happens there. His second type is synthetic, which again isn't a helpful term, but what he means is very interesting, and that is that art often synthesizes ideas in a new way, ideas and languages. It's really collage. Much art is actually collage in the sense that old ideas are combined in a new way. Mm-hmm. And thirdly is critical activist, which is kind of self-explanatory. To what extent is this work of art an action that is critical of society and that may in fact be trying of itself to change it? And fourthly, one very dear to Jungians, arts-based research can be improvisatory. It can be about the flow, the discovery of the flow, which is a state of the psyche where the ego isn't in control. And you could say that it's telling us something about the psyche. It's telling us something about the nature of being, but improvisatory. Mm-hmm. And so I find those quite useful as ways of generating meaning. They're not the only ways meaning can be generated, but if I'm working with students, if they apply those 4 ideas, there's a lot of stuff that starts to come up. Mm-hmm. Oh, and the other thing that's kind of implicit in all this is that we could treat any existing work of art as Jungian arts-based research. If we applied some of these ideas as lenses to look at the work, you could actually reinterpret the work as a piece of research.
Yeah, sure. That makes total sense if we think that the image has its own autonomy and
Mm,
that once it's projected into the world, it's kind of released into the wild where it
yes.
can continue to live and to
Mm,
inform others for years to come.
mm,
Even if that wasn't the artist's intention, it doesn't matter. It's because
yeah,
the image has its own kind of
yeah,
objectives,
yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. I mean, the artist's intention doesn't matter very much at all in this.
Mhm.
And one of the ways in which our culture is stuck is by uh, being hung up on artist's intention. It's the intention behind the art that
Right.
can't
It's
be art. Yeah.
it's more about the write-up about the art than sometimes the art itself. Like
Mm,
the art itself can be quite I don't know, unprovocative or uninteresting, but there's so much emphasis placed on
mm,
the explication of the work by
mm.
the artist. Like the artist's statement is
Yeah,
sometimes more uh,
yeah, that's right.
mm,
That's right. And
mhm,
really, it's the shift from a materialist worldview in two senses, because capitalism comes into this. But also, here are these objects, to a much more animated, even animist worldview where everything is alive, especially art, because it has so much concentrated psyche in it that is now free, as you say, free in the wild to do its own thing.
mhm. Yeah. I think the framework of arts-based research also broadens our conception, our definition of what is art.
Yes,
Yeah. And
yes.
so handicrafts,
Mm.
uh, yeah, most anything
Yeah,
kind of produced out of culture or out of an
yeah,
individual.
absolutely. Anything that that is enacted with a wholeness of psyche
Hmm.
can be regarded as art in these terms. Yeah. Um,
Well, last week, here's an example, and let me run it by you and see what you think. But last week, I spoke to a scholar of Aztec metaphysics and philosophy.
mm,
And my wife's a weaver, and so I talked about weaving and
mm,
textiles. And there's this kind of amazing thing that happens in what I don't know, what I would say are like integrated cultures where there
mm,
isn't the separation of subject, object, and all of that. So the act of weaving itself, the weaver is reenacting a mythological creation story
yeah.
every time that they make the weaving, and then the weaving itself um, becomes a reflection of a cosmology or of a story or of
Mm,
some of the tapestries I have of a song that
mm,
tells
mm,
of a plant spirit or
mm,
something like that. And so that kind of like deep integration,
mm,
an anthropologist might come along and go, well, weaving is part of
mm,
the handicraft culture.
mm,
But if
mm,
you talk to the women doing the weaving, they'll say, well, I'm weaving this song, and they'll be able to
mm,
sing you the song as they do their weaving or embroidery. And there's something about that that is so profound, and I don't have words for
mm,
what that is, but it's like philosophy and practice or something. But even that is because a philosophy would be a study of something, and so there's
mm.
not even that kind of separation, but it's a complete immersion in the cosmic reality of the people or something. I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if you can help me
Um,
find better words for that.
Well, I mean, in a sense, that kind of weaving is joining in the weaving of the world, so that the weaving isn't about the weaving of creation, it is an extension of the weaving of creation.
Right, right. It's not about the thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah. So there is a sense in which any kind of it's a profoundly religious act because you're involved in the whole processes of creation that are revealed here as very complex, and reaching out to human beings to get us involved in them, but it can't be involved on a rational ego level. It has to be involved on a experiential, bodily, and unconscious level.
Yeah, well, like you in your introduction to the book, you talk about Jung's typology, and so that participatory
Mm,
making
mm,
would be more happening on the intuitive and the
mm.
sensual level. It's happening through the body, guided
Yeah,
by some irrational, quote
yeah.
unquote, intuition.
Mm,
Um, this is another one of those areas where I have some problems with Jung, because I think what I'm talking about is what he was pointing at with the term participation mystique, that
yes.
anthropological term, which for him, he saw that as a lower level of
Mm,
consciousness, and that Western civilization had evolved consciousness to the point where we're no longer kind of
mm,
embedded in
mm,
this participatory relationship to the cosmos.
mm,
And I can't see how that is where we're at
mm.
is some kind of an improvement on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that so-called previous
Yeah.
level of consciousness.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of stuff there. I mean, one is participation mystique isn't Jung's term. He's kind of absorbed it, I think, from Levi Strauss, uh, who also thought of it as some kind of primitive
Mhm.
connection to things that the civilized world had got beyond, and this was a good thing. And in both cases, this is pure colonialism, and in a sense, in Jung, incoherent, because
Mhm.
he's revealing the problems of a culture which refuses to encourage this particular relationship to reality. Um, I mean, when I talk to students about the subject-object split, they sort of understand it as, oh yeah, yeah, that's the way things are. And then, yeah, but how about gravity? How about oxygen? It's actually, the subject-object split is actually not the way things are. It is a view of reality that has had huge impacts on the kind of culture that has taken it to this extreme. Including the idea that we're all separate beings, and therefore we have to have a competitive world where we fight each other for the goods of the world. All of these things are not only causing us terrible problems, they're not true at a fundamental level of what is real. So, Jung has racism, and he has sexism, and he doesn't get out of sufficiently his colonial mindset. I mean, he there are intimations of it when he has that famous encounter with Mountain Lake and sees in Mountain Lake's eyes the shadow of white colonialism in the cruel bird of prey. But he never follows that through and continues to kind of continue depict this primitive mindset, as he calls it, as something that Western modernity has rightly left behind, when he also reveals that it's this disconnection from nature and
Mhm.
other humans and the world that is so much part of our problems.
Yeah, it's the seed of our eventual destruction. Uh,
Mm,
it's interesting when he uses the word primitive, because sometimes he's using it in a kind of derogatory way, but then
mm,
other times talks about the primitive as primal, as primary,
Yeah,
uh, and therefore something of value that's been
yeah,
lost, like
yeah.
in his dream of the house's psyche. It's like
Mm.
it's the foundation, but it's
Yeah.
been buried and kind of kept shut up in the cellar for too long.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. And I think that
he's a
that
contradictory guy,
ambivalence,
right? And so
yeah, well, I
we
think
can't
that
just
ambivalence is valuable because it shows that there are there are contradictions within his writing that we can kind of say, yeah, this, Jung was getting somewhere and he didn't quite make it, so we've got to do differently.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fantastic. I mean, you're obviously a very capable teacher, because I felt like I've learned a lot here. I mean, there's some things that I think we've gone past that I won't circle back to. Maybe as a way to finish, kind of personally, this curiosity I have about the attraction that people who are into depth psychology have with the detective and mystery novels. Like,
Mm.
because I've spoken to Tom Moore a number of times,
Mm.
and I know that he really likes to read
Mm.
detective novels.
Mm.
I've always loved detective novels. I'm reading a kind of a postmodern detective novel now by J.G. Ballard,
Mhm.
who I'm sure you've read because he's very psychological and kind of post-structuralist, let's
Mhm.
say. He likes to mess with form. Uh, and I was thinking, like, well, what is it? Because there's maybe
Mhm.
something going on here. And I thought, well, maybe it's because we're all interested in delving into a mystery,
Mhm.
and we're into investigation, like, so
Mhm.
investigating the nature
Mhm.
of the self, of the psyche.
Mhm.
And so maybe this is what attracts us to that kind of
Mhm.
fiction. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I've thought about this a lot, and I hope you may consider reading my Mary Wandwalker detective novels, which are published by Chiron. They're Detective novels and depth psychology kind of erupted at the same time in the 19th century.
Hmm.
And in the figure of the detective, you have the proto-analyst, because the detective is searching for clues, having to kind of sift through kind of confusing clues and searching for what is hidden.
Right. Yeah. Seeing
Yeah.
through surface stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. So there's something culturally going on that links the two of them. There's and I guess from our point of view, one of the things is the way in which a detective novel itself has a lot of individuation in it, because one can see the detective as a kind of ego figure that usually gets, in some sense, deconstructed by the processes of detecting. And eventually, uh, well, often discovers that the criminal is someone a bit like the detective, and there's often a kind of sense of the detective and the criminal as being
Yeah.
a
The
kind of,
double.
yeah, the double
Yeah.
and the shadow and all the
Yeah.
rest of it.
So true.
Um, the detective form itself is very mythical and is so Dorothy L. Sayers said that the detective was like the Grail Knight,
Hmm.
who was kind of searching for the solution that will heal the community. And the form of detective novel that I like very much is emphasizes that murder is the crime that a community cannot survive unless it is solved. It has to be solved for the community to survive. So you've got an archetypal dynamic there,
Hmm.
the drive to solve it, to save the community. And in many cases, what you get is a kind of Grail myth, whereby the finding the solution does heal the wasteland. It does transform the community back into something viable. And there is also a form of detective where the detective discovers that there is so much more evil than he or she can actually manage to ameliorate, and in which case the detective becomes a tragic figure. And we, the readers, have learned that there is so much more underneath the surface that we do not yet know about our world. I, in particular, decided I wanted to deconstruct anything egoic about the detective by having my detective as the triple goddess. So my stories center on three women, with the crone as the lead detective, and she works with a motherly woman who is not a literal mother but has chronic clinical depression, because I wanted to write a hero with depression, not a rescuing of someone with depression, but that living with something like depression can be heroic. And the maiden, the young woman in the group of three, she is a maiden not because she's never had sex, but because she has never been loved. She was actually trafficked. And I suppose my archetypal instinct about the world has been for many years that the trafficked woman is some kind of image that sums up a lot of what's wrong with the world. So I wanted to have her again, not as a victim, but as someone who is trying to be the hero, is trying to do something good.
Wow, sounds great. I'm definitely going to read those, and it's not surprising that your detective novels or your mystery novels are published by Chiron, who
Yeah,
publishes primarily psychological works.
that's right. That's
Um,
right.
there's something about that, that I've been thinking about more and more the past number of years. I've always been an avid reader, and as I've gotten more into depth psychology and start kind of looking through that lens, I've seen like the act of reading fiction as maybe we could say alchemical. It's a form of psychology in
Mm,
itself, and it can be transformational.
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it, this can be true of, staying with, having a relationship with any kind of art, that if you allow reading fiction, it takes a certain amount of time and it takes a certain amount of
Focus.
focus. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so you're allowing the images in the story to take you somewhere. So you are actually individuating through um, through that reading process. So just as writing a novel can be individuating, so can reading a novel, so can doing a painting and having a relationship with a painting. And it is, in that sense, it is alchemical, and not a surprise, because artists stuck with alchemy for those centuries when the scientists gave up alchemy. There's one more point here, you know, that I wanted to make in response to other things that you've said, which is where we've got to with our, you know, uh, with our modern science is quantum physics, which is this suggests that there are deeper layers of entanglement that appear very irrational to us. And there's got to be a sense in which all these indigenous cosmologies and the practice of alchemy and quantum physics, that there is a convergence here. And it may not be a convergence in a rational way where you have one language that explains how reality works, it may be that it's much more likely we're going to need lots of languages, and there'll be more languages in the future. And that's really what this transdisciplinarity of Niculescu's is about. That, but that there's a sense in which we can see something like Jungian arts-based research as having a connection with this quantum level of reality, just as it may have a connection with indigenous cultures' practices.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, if you've investigated these other ways of knowing at all, you look at something like quantum theory and you go, well, yeah, like people have
Yes,
known this forever. And so
yes.
maybe it's just like this young field of science is finally maturing to a level where it can hold the tension of the known and the unknown, of the rational and the irrational,
Yeah,
just like our own psyches, or let's say egos, can mature to hold those kind of tensions.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I'd quite agree.
yeah.
Mm.
Just one other thing about the detective novel.
Oh.
As you were talking, it's like, oh, for sure. Like everything you said really rings true to me, and I'm starting to see uh, the kind of reflection of one's own individuation in those kind of novels, and how the novel can actually help to help the individuation process along. Like
Mhm.
if I read a novel and I'm identifying with a number of characters,
Mm.
there's that kind of the separating
Mm.
of the congealed self into many
Mm.
selves,
Mhm.
many impulses, many experiences, all of that. Um, there's also this thing that has come up in a recent series, the Jodie Foster series, Night Country, where she plays
Mhm.
a kind of crone-like detective,
Mm.
and she's got a younger detective that she's working with, and just there's a little
Mm.
bit of that trinity like you were talking about. But her thing is like her job is to always find the right question.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
that reminded me of the Grail myth,
yeah,
that
absolutely. Yeah,
that the key to healing is finding the right question at the right time.
yeah.
And Jodie Foster's character, that's like her modus operandi, is
Mm.
to always ask the right question. And I
Mm.
think that we're if we're practicing psychology in any, professionally or not, it is often about asking the right question at the right time that
Mm.
opens us up to a wider, maybe surprising
Mm.
perspective or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we can see that that is what happens in many depth-oriented therapies, but it's also what happens in our relationship with art, whether we are making it or just being with it, that it shifts things around. And so there is a need to kind of reformulate the questions that we're living with and are being addressed to us. And in a sense, this Jungian arts-based research is a way of recognizing that those questions are perhaps the most important questions, are the ones don't that don't feel located in our conscious selves, but are coming to us from elsewhere.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, and that speaks to that idea of how would you put it? But the idea of incompleteness as a
Yes.
part of Jung psychology and of Jungian based arts research. So incompleteness, like an acknowledgement that we'll never know everything, that there'll
Yeah.
always be more to discover, I guess.
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
puts the ego in a place of humility,
That's right.
which I think is very
We're
healthy.
always living in a mystery.
Hmm. Beautiful.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being so generous with your time and sharing with us. And I'm going to include links to both the arts-based research book and your detective books on Chiron as well. So I look forward to reading those. And Yeah, once again, thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great talking to you.
All right, cheers. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.